I'm Yvette Ruiz with the Office of Nonprofit Engagement at JPMorgan Chase. And I have the esteemed honor of introducing our keynote this afternoon, Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and resident at PolicyLink. But before I do that, I'd like to share a bit with you as to why this conversation, housing and equity, is so critically important. 78589. I'll say it once more. 78589. That's the zip code in the Rio Grande Valley I was born and raised in. And according to the data, based on my zip code and Latino ethnicity, I should have only partially completed college. I'll likely die around 77 years of age due to lack of quality health care, and I'll only earn 40 cents for every dollar that my white male counterparts earn. The moment I was born, through no fault of my own, my financial future course was set, largely because of geography, but mostly because of the large systemic inequities at play in our country. And in case you were wondering, that's not equity. Today, in Austin, 36% of our residents live in liquid asset poverty. Now, liquid asset poverty is defined by the percentage of households without sufficient liquid assets to subsist at the poverty level for 3 months in the absence of income. Stated differently, or in another way, liquid asset poverty is when a household does not have at least, in Austin, $2,000 in liquid assets to weather a financial shock. There's no question the Austin community is an economic powerhouse for some. And we are brought together today to discuss housing and equity, but the conversation that's been at play here all day around improving the economic circumstances of our most vulnerable community goes way deeper than housing and equity. It's about building the financial strength and resilience for low-income communities. As LMI financial health grows, so does the ability to purchase a home, open businesses, fund education, support political candidates, and secure our children's financial future. When we shore up the finances of our families, the benefits go far beyond the household. We're building strength and influence as a community. But you know just as well as I do that the dollars and cents and data, it's more than about those three things. It's about the pride and dignity a family feels when they move into their first home, the confidence children develop about attending college when they know their parents have managed to save even a modest amount of money, and then being able to age with dignity, knowing that our golden years won't be spent in poverty. To thrive, communities need investment beyond the urban core to create neighborhoods where diverse individuals and families at all income levels can live. Neighborhoods are key for any city's long-term economic success. JPMorgan Chase has completely focused in Austin on supporting the development of affordable housing and workforce development. We have partnered with organizations like Foundation Communities, Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation on several new and very exciting housing developments. We're doing some really great capacity building work with TACDC and the Texas State Affordable Housing Corporation. And the kind of capacity building work that we're doing is not only organizational support, but really goes deep into the inner workings with developers that are led by people of color, supporting communities of color. We have partnered with Workforce Solutions, Austin Community College, and Seton to support career pipelines with jobs that pay fair wages. In the conversation right before this, we were talking about the corporate sector's responsibility, because it's the right thing to do, to pay their people something above the minimum wage. And I was so happy that maybe they weren't talking about us, because last January, a firm right initiative, a $20 million investment plan was launched internally to increase the minimum wage for all of our branch and customer service facing employees from $12 an hour to at least a $15 an hour to a cap at $20. That affects 22,000 employees across the United States. Later this afternoon, we'll learn more about employer-assisted housing policies and resident ownership of manufactured homes, both of which we are strong supporters of philanthropically. Now, I can go on, and I'm getting the please wrap, so I'll stop now, but I'll leave you with this. The pressing need to expand opportunities for individuals to move up the economic ladder is not a new problem, but it requires new partnerships. The private sector not only has a vested interest, but can also make a real contribution to fostering opportunity in ways that far beyond the traditional model of simply writing a check. And I'm so proud to say that in this community, we, JP Morgan Chase, are here for you. We still have so much to learn, and I'm so thrilled that today we are taking a pause moment to learn from one of the greats. Angela Glover Blackwell is with us today, acting as a beacon of light in the fight for equality, and she has been a leading voice in the movement for equity in America. Ms. Blackwell started PolicyLink in 1999 with the mission of advancing racial and economic equity for all. Through her writing, speaking, and leadership, she has helped to grow and define a national equity movement focused on innovating and improving public policy with a wide range of partners to ensure access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color. She is our honored guest today, so please join me in giving Angela a warm Austin welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I definitely wanted to start by acknowledging that you are doing a good job. I know that you are very aware of the problems that you have. I can hear in your conversation, I was here yesterday as well as today, that you're appropriately being tough on yourself, that even though you think that you have good values, and even though you have passed some good policies, people are being severely and disproportionately left behind, and you are not satisfied with that. You are dissatisfied. As I have looked around the country at places that are trying, Austin stands out, and I just want you to know that, because you do have a long way to go, but I so appreciate what you're doing, because I end up in a lot of places where people are not doing it, they're not trying. There are places where people should be ashamed and embarrassed, and they are not. There are places where people are moving backwards instead of moving forward. There are places where those who are being left behind feel unseen, forgotten, and uncared for. This is not that place, and I'm happy to be here. We're working with you. We're working with you because we can learn from you. One of the things that we have understood at PolicyLink for a long time is that cities are coming back. We went through a period in which cities were just dying. They were not anything that the country cared for. And it became pretty obvious to some of us decades ago that cities were coming back. And we had to make sure that the people who had been there during the bad times got to stay and enjoy the benefits of that coming back. And those of us who have been working on it have not been able to be successful. The trend is still the trend, that those who were there during the bad times are getting pushed out. But we've started something called the All-In Cities Anti-Displacement Network. It was a competitive process for cities to get into it. Austin is in it. Your mayor comes to the convenings. He joins for the webinars, as well as others from this community who are doing it. And while we appreciate the participation because we want people to participate and learn from each other, we appreciate your participation because we are learning from you. We also have another thing that we're doing with the National League of Cities, where we're working with economic development officers around the country to pull them into a cohort so they can learn from each other, so they can know what's at the cutting edge. And this is one of the cities that we have the fellow. And we are lifting up things like the bond measure that you passed as best practice for what it is we need to do around the country. So I just want to thank you for what you're doing and hope that you appreciate that you're making progress. And we have a long way to go, because the best ideas and the best commitments and the best intentions will not get us out of the hole that we have dug ourselves into as a nation because of the way that we have treated people of color, because of our history of racism, overt and systemic, that we have a long way to go. We did not get here by accident. It was planned. Policies reinforced aspirations. And we got to the terrible point that racism got on automatic steroids so that people could turn away and it would continue to churn out inequity, whether you paid attention to it or not. It just got baked into the system. And so we have a system in which people who are of color, people who are black, people who are Latino, people who are Native American, others are having a very difficult time, even when we have progressive cities like Austin and the Twin Cities and Oakland, California, and places where people are really trying hard. Earlier, I've loved every panel that I've seen this morning, and I thought that the speaker, Richard Reeves, when he talked about dream hoarders, I thought his presentation was terrific. He said a couple of things that I disagreed with, though. I didn't disagree with what he said. I disagreed with it being said universally. If you're black and brown, take your children to work. And I'm going to tell you why you need to take your children to work. Because if you're black and brown, or black or brown, it turns out that one of the hardest things to do when you get to the middle class is to be able to stay there. That 45% of black children born into the middle class will end up poor. Just because you have a salary that puts you middle class does not mean that you don't have to make extraordinary efforts for your children to understand what it takes to stay there. For them to have a sense of what it's like to work in places where people are doing professional jobs and who's there and how do you operate within those systems. Take your children to work. Take some of their friends to work with you, but take your children, because your children are going to have as hard a time as their friends. My son, when he went to the public schools in Oakland, California, had a bunch of guys who he was friendly with who did not have the same opportunities that my son had. But I had to struggle for my son not to operate as if he didn't have the opportunities that he had, because the standard in his community was different, and we lived in the community because it was important to us to live there. The other thing that I think is very important to do is that if you are a black person, if you're Latino, and you have a network, try to get your kid an internship. Use those connections. Use those connections. You've worked hard, not just to get a salary, not just to get a house, not just to get an education. You went to that school that you went to so you would have a network. Don't stop using that network. How do you think people got to where they are? So that's what it's like, that even when you hear someone like Richard telling you, those of you who are white, to be self-conscious about the things that continue to create inequality, know that the racial inequality is so deep that even if you are upper middle class black in this country, you still need assistance. Your situation is precarious, and we've got to figure out a way to hold those thoughts in our heads at one time. Part of my job here today is easier than it is in lots of places where I go. And part of it is harder. Let me tell you about the easier part. I go a lot of places where people are clueless as to what they can do to try to create an equitable society. And so in my 20 minutes, not only do I have to talk about what the problem is, talk about how we got here, I have to use a lot of time giving examples, talking about the language to put in a policy, tell people what the benefits are going to be if you do it. You know what you want to do. You've got a lot of good policy ideas. You're being thwarted. You're being thwarted by a state that doesn't share your aspirations. Preemption is a real problem. You're being thwarted by an economy and decisions that are being made at the federal level that make it difficult for you to do the things that you want to do, but you know what it is that needs to happen. You've got to nuance it. What you need is to understand the urgency of now. You need to understand that you don't have time to let these things work out along the way. And let me tell you why. There were a couple of things that are very much defining this moment. One is that at last, we are having a national conversation about race. Now, we've been calling for it for a long time, but we're having it. And I have been doing this work in the flow of movement and change and changing labels and changing aspirations. And I can testify that never in my years of being a change agent, and I have been doing it for 50 years. I came out of college in 1967. For 50 years, I have been doing this work. I have never seen a time when we have been talking as forthrightly as we are about race right now. That's a big deal. Don't let this conversation go away. Do not grow tired. Do not grow weary. Keep it going. This is the most important conversation that can be had in the United States of America. It is. And we're having it. And we're having it. The next thing that's going on right now is that the demographics are shifting in this nation in a way that is fast and profound. Now, Texas and California have been states in which the majority of people of color for some time, so this is not news here. But it is news for the nation that by 2044, the majority of people in this country will be of color. It is news that since 2012, the majority of babies born in this country have been of color. It is news to a lot of people by the end of next year. By the end of next year, the majority of all children under 18 in the United States of America will be of color. By 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. But it's even faster than that data would suggest because the of color population is young and the white population is old. And therefore, I'm sorry, and therefore, when we think about who's sending children to school, who's buying homes, who's raising family, who's building community, who's invested in the democratic process, all of those things that really fuel activity, energy, imagination, creativity, they are being driven by a population that's already majority color. And that's the young people and young people with families. As we think about everything that's going to happen, there's one other thing we have to keep front and center. And that is that we're experiencing a failure of capitalism. Capitalism has always been unfair. But those for whom it was most unfair were invisible and uncared for. So it seemed to be working. But it's not working for a lot of people now. Part of the crisis that has us wringing our hands appropriately is the sadness and the tragedy of the opiate addictions that's going on. It is so sad. But it definitely manifests itself as a failure of an economic system in which people do not have hope. And this failure creates an amazing opportunity to rethink it without having to say, we need a completely different system. Maybe we do need a completely different system, but the system we have is so broken, we might find if we do a lot of fixing, it could last us a little while. But it has to be some radical fixing. It's got to be very different than the way it operates now. Now take these three things together. We have a moment where we can really have conversations about capitalism without being accused of being anti-United States. We can have it because the times demand it. That's a wonderful moment to begin to think, how do we have a system in which people who want to work can work? How do we have a system in which the basics that people have always thought they could depend on are universally available? How do we have a system in which the creativity that drives capitalism can really be tapped within the communities that are experiencing that imagination, that creativity? When we start answering those questions, we'll be a lot better off. But it requires that we do what? We tap the people who are going to be the future. The fate of the nation is now totally dependent on those who have been systematically left behind. The fate of the nation is now dependent on those who have been systematically left behind, our communities of color. That we need for people to be educated. We need for people to participate. We need for people to be involved in business as leaders and as workers. We need for innovators to be able to bring those innovations to the core, to the forefront, and to be able to move forward with them. And so, at a moment when all of a sudden, what we have been thinking as only a moral imperative has become an economic imperative. What we have thought of as a moral imperative, and many people have gone a long way with that moral imperative. They've done some good work with it. They've set up philanthropy. They've reached out to others. They've innovated. They've developed programs. They've done a lot of good stuff. But they were doing it on the fringe of society because morally, in a country that is so rich and so influential, we shouldn't have all this being left behind. It has now become an economic imperative. The economy is dependent on those we have been systematically leaving behind. And part of the process of leaving them behind has been because of our screwed up notions about race and inclusion and inferiority and superiority and rights and no rights and this and that and that and this, that we have been leaving people behind based on race. And just at the moment when we need to overcome our racial blind spots, our racism, our structural embeddedness baked in, we're having a conversation about race. We're looking at the criminal justice system and acknowledging that it has been unjust and people have been locked up who should never have had that happen to them, that there's a racial component to what we are doing in terms of policing, in terms of incarceration, in terms of all of those things in the justice system that are wrong. We are understanding that as we need people to be contributors to the economy, that they come without the education that they need, they come without the resources they need. When we started PolicyLink, one of our mantras was that where you live in America is a proxy for opportunity. You tell me your address and I can tell you way more than I should ever be able to. I can tell you whether or not you are likely to have access to a good school. I can tell you whether or not you live in a natural job network, and that's how we get our jobs, that people around you have jobs. Somebody says, oh, they're hiring over here, come with me. How'd you get your first job? You got it through a natural job network. If you don't live near one, if nobody's working in your community, you're not gonna get started early, you're not gonna get started well. You tell me what your zip code is, and I can tell you how long you're gonna live and how well you're gonna live while you live. It just shouldn't be that way, but we said that. Where you live is a proxy for opportunity. Now, Raj Chetty has come along. He's looked at the biggest data ever, and he has proven the same thing. I don't know that that's progress. It was obvious some time ago, but at least now people are believing it. We're believing it, that where you live really determines what your opportunity ought to be. And so there's not much that can be more important once you have that realization than thinking about why is that and what are we going to do to fix it. There's several things that we need to do to fix it. We need to make sure that people can live near opportunity. There's your housing problem right there, that people can live near opportunity. If you have a community that has good schools and access to jobs, people ought to be able to live there. Not just rich people, all people. But the other thing that you can do is you can make sure that if people can't live near opportunity, they need to connect to opportunity throughout the region, which means that we need to have a transit system, a public transit system that does that. We need to have job linkage programs so that we're linking jobs to schools that are in communities. But the highest form of what I'm describing to you as regional equity is that all communities ought to be a community of opportunity. Every community should be a community of opportunity. We absolutely need to say, what is it that we need, and make sure that those things get implanted there. I know that I'm not telling you anything you don't know, because all the policies, all the strategies I've been hearing you talk about try to get at just that. What I want to do is put a sense of urgency on your mind, because we can't just wait to see how these policies play out. We can't just wait until we're not preempting what you want to do in Texas anymore. We've got to take some risk. We've got to challenge, sue me, okay? Sue me. We've got to challenge people. You go on and do what you need to do and accept the consequences later, and maybe as you get involved in the litigation, we start to make some changes. We need to make sure that we are getting outside of the comfort zone of people. So you need to have these conversations with people that you don't usually have them. I remember after November 2016, the election that happened then, I was in an elevator. I was in New York City, in an elevator in New York City. I was alone. I did not know the other people in the elevator, and I don't think they knew each other either. But the conversation was, they were all white, that they were not going home for Thanksgiving because they couldn't sit at the Thanksgiving table with their relatives, because they couldn't have a conversation about what had just taken place in their country. And I remember thinking, I didn't try to start up a conversation with them, I wish they would go home. I wish they would sit at the table, because we cannot bury our heads. You cannot bury your heads. You have got to have this conversation about the urgency. Help people to see that the diversity in this nation is an extraordinary gift. A gift just at the time that it is needed. A gift that is undeserved, perhaps. But what the country needs is it needs youth. It needs to be young. Nations all over the world are crying because their populations are so old and they don't have young people. We have young people in this country. It's because of diversity. That in a global economy, what could be more exciting than to live in a world nation? A world nation in which people are connected by kinship, by language, by custom, by familiarity. We have that, and it comes with our diversity. What can be more exciting in a place that is driven by innovation and capitalism and all of the things that go with it than to have people who have skin in the game? It is that skin in the game to make sure that communities work, to make sure that work is made easier, to make sure that children can thrive. That skin in the game of the public schools, that skin in the game of community life, what will cause businesses to really stay fresh, to know what's next, and to have people who are already thinking about that. The diversity is a gift. It is a gift at the exact time that the nation needs it. We have a democratic imperative, an economic imperative, a moral imperative, and everything that we need at our fingertips. But we gotta get over this reluctance of can't make people uncomfortable. We have to get over this reluctance that we can't have policies in place that call out race and difference. We didn't get to this situation without being clear about race. We knew who we were making the policies for here in, was it 1928 or whatever that, I hear you talking about something in 28, was that it? You knew who you were talking about in this place. We knew who we were trying as a nation to keep back when we make decision after decision. We're going to have to be just as clear-eyed as we think about bringing people forward. It is not enough to build affordable housing. We need to build affordable housing, but it is not enough. The housing crisis represents a market failure. We have got to do more than build. We can't build ourselves out of this. We're going to have to do some things to make up for the fact that the market is failing. We can't build ourselves out of this crisis. We're going to have to figure out how to be able to make housing available, affordable, sustainable as people go forward. We're going to need government intervention. We're going to need subsidy. We're going to need creativity. We have a problem in terms of policing. We can't reform ourselves out of that issue because the police were never set up for the kind of safety that we want for our communities. That's not why we develop police. We develop police to catch runaway slaves. We develop police to protect property. We didn't develop police to have safe communities for everybody. So we need to stop thinking police and think safety. It means we're going to have some radical imagination as we go forward. We are not a healthy nation. When you stack us up against other nations, we're nowhere near the top. We're not just not at the top, we can't see the top. And we can't see the top because the people who are of color in this nation, who are rapidly becoming the majority, have not had access to health care, have not had access to healthy communities. And so diabetes and heart disease and hypertension and all of those things are problems that we can't treat ourselves out of this problem. We are going to have to create healthy communities. We're going to have to create access to grocery stores. We're going to have to create access to healthy places to exercise. And the development process controls all of that. Every single thing I've talked about is impacted by the development process. When we are developing, we are deciding where we're going to put things. When we are developing, we are deciding where we're going to have access to education. When we are developing, we are doing employment policy because we are making those decisions. Therefore, we've got to really be driven by equitable development. That in the development process, you're not just building a house, you're not just building a shopping center, you're not just creating a community, you are creating a nation. You are responding to the imperative that says everybody has to participate. So we've got to integrate people in place. We've got to integrate strategies around people with strategies around place. Transportation decisions absolutely are going to impact health decisions, education decisions, job decisions. We have to develop in ways in which we consciously reduce disparities, local and regionally. What are the disparities and how do we reduce them? In Oakland, California, after years of an Army base having been abandoned, they finally got the go-ahead and resources to be able to bring it back and make it a logistics center. 3,000 jobs were going to be developed there. A year before ground was broken, they opened a training center in the poorest community in Oakland. And they started training people for the jobs that they knew would come a year before the center was in the community where people would need the jobs. By the time they opened it, you know, people, of course, got jobs and things have been going very well there. We need to develop in ways in which we're recognizing our disparities and we're consciously reducing them. We also have to make sure that anytime we're developing, that we're producing economic return for investors, the right things for the economy, and the right things for people, triple bottom line. And that some of that means we got to pay attention to the entrepreneurial opportunities. We have to give a special leg up to the minority and women entrepreneurs in the community. We need to be thinking about what is it communities need. We got to think differently. We have to think differently. And none of what I have described can happen if in the development process we are not consciously working in full partnership with the people whose lives are going to be impacted by these decisions. Black people, Latino people, Native American people, they need to have agency in the things that are happening in their communities. They need to have voice. Their wisdom and voice has to absolutely guide and determine what is going to happen there. If they are not full partners, you will miss many things that are important. And the good news about this, and I'm going to wrap up in about 2 minutes, and I'm going to take questions, so if you need to start thinking about them, please do. The good news about this is that by focusing on those who are most vulnerable, you will solve the problems for everybody. And that's the opposite of what we've trained ourselves to think. That we rarely go to the most vulnerable as the universal solution for everybody. But I'm just going to point out something that you all know. It's those curb cuts in the sidewalk. When you are out and you are moving around, there are curb cuts in the sidewalk at the corner. You know why they are there? They are there because of advocacy with people, for people with disabilities in wheelchairs, who even as they were making progress in terms of rights, understood that those rights were hollow without the ability to actually move around the community and get to jobs, to get to facilities. And so we have those curb cuts. How many times have you been pushing a stroller and been so happy you didn't have to pick up that contraption from sidewalk to sidewalk? How many times have workers been pushing carts and pulling wagons and had their work made easier because of those curb cuts? How many times, like me, did you catch that train because you didn't have to break your stride as you were moving across town trying to get someplace with the wheelie thing? Lives are saved because of those curb cuts, because they've been study after study that's shown that 9 out of 10 unencumbered adults cross the street at the corner because they're oriented because of that curb cut. It is an example of you solve a problem with nuance and specificity for those who are most vulnerable, and the benefits cascade out. Once you know what to look for, the curb cut effect is every place. Not smoking in public places. Can you imagine how many lives have been saved by that? You know where that movement started? On airplanes, the advocacy of flight attendants. If you've been around as long as I have, you remember One, sitting next to somebody who was smoking the entire flight. Can you even imagine that? Two, when they started to make a little progress, they had a no smoking section. It did not do any good if you were sitting right in front of the no smoking section, but it didn't do any good at all if you were the flight attendant having to move up and down. And so it was the advocacy of flight attendants that got us to start down the path of not smoking when you were endangering others. And look what has happened. Seatbelts. You know how seatbelts started? Started because of the advocacy for children. When I was a little girl and I was in the car with my mom and dad and they'd come to a stop, they just put out their hand. I was always on the floor. You know, it just didn't do it. You go, boom. It started because of advocacy for children. And look at the lives that have been saved. You solve a problem with specificity and nuance for those who are most vulnerable, and the benefits cascade outward. The would-be gold standard of the curb cut effect would be the GI Bill if it had not been administered in such a racist fashion. But the GI Bill made the misspoke. The GI Bill made the white middle class. Education, it did. Before the GI Bill, there were only 58 community colleges in the country. Within a couple of years, there were almost 400. Imagine that. The GI Bill has more senators, people who were Nobel laureates, teachers, lawyers. But the GI Bill started because some people were thinking, as the 16 million veterans were returning from World War II, that about 100,000 of them might have trouble integrating back into society. And on the back of a napkin, somebody sketched out the basics of the GI Bill. 8 million took advantage of the education component alone. Millions more took advantage of the mortgage. The mortgage and the building of the suburbs and the infrastructure, the GI Bill made the white middle class. Just think what would have happened if it hadn't been such a discriminatory process of moving it forward. Again, an example of you solve a problem for the most vulnerable with nuance and specificity, and you solve it in ways that the benefits cascade out. So as I have talked about equity being the superior growth model, as I have talked about equity being the economic imperative, when we do that, we'll not just be solving the problems for those who have been left behind. We will solve the problems for a lot of people who are suffering, who are white, who are struggling to stay in the middle class, who have already dropped out, who are desperately seeking something to give them some hope, who are angry, who are frightened. This feels bad right now because we're so divided as a nation. But it's pretty clear to me that those who are fighting hard to be able to go back, people who are nostalgic for a time that never was, while ignoring a future that is inevitable, those people are in what I think of as the last gasp. They are yesterday. They are not tomorrow. What they want is not going to happen because we're going to go back. It's going to happen because we're going to go forward with inclusion and dreams and aspirations. The last gasp can be long and dangerous and shrill, but trust me, it is last. And as we think about what it is you all are trying to do it more, do it better, do it confrontational, do it without apology, do it and get sued and stand up and do it again, because what you are creating is going to solve the nation's problems. Local leaders are national leaders because they are solving the nation's problems. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I'm trying to read. Thank you. Thank you for that. I see a question here. It's wondering if I can speak to appropriate regulation for development that addresses, where'd it go? What did it say? Thank you. Hard to do that by regulation. You're not going to have one sweeping regulation. I think that if we had a job guarantee program, if we had a regulation for a job guarantee program, and PolicyLink is working hard to get a federal job guarantee, that would do a lot about structural racism, because we keep trying to find ways to open up job opportunities for people, ways to kind of undo the fact that we have so many people sitting on the sideline. And you know the unemployment figures say nothing about who's sitting on the sidelines, people who are discouraged, et cetera. I think we need to have a federal job guarantee. Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton think so too. And it's a growing consensus in the country that we need to do that. And while it may sound like a wild idea, it's what we did after the Depression. We have done this before. A job guarantee program with a minimum wage of $15 an hour would keep us from having to go community by community by community trying to get to $15 an hour. You have a job guarantee of $15 an hour, and all of a sudden we're all going to be making $15 an hour as a minimum. I was at a meeting where we were talking about this, and somebody said, but if you have a job guarantee program that pays $15 an hour, that's going to put a lot of pressure on private businesses, and they're probably going to lose a lot of employees that are going to go to the federal job guarantee. And someone in the meeting said, that is a feature of the program, not a flaw. And so I think that is the kind of thing we need to do. It's big, it's bold, it gets everybody in. I think that we need to have free, high-quality public education from preschool through an associate's degree. There is no reason not to do that. We know that by the end of 2020, 48% of all jobs in this country will require at least an associate's degree. Something like 27% of African Americans, 27% of Latinos, 14% of recent immigrants have it. The people who are going to be the future aren't ready for the future. We need to put that on speed up. We need to make sure that everybody at least has an associate's degree. And if you have free through an associate's degree, it makes a 4-year degree much cheaper. We're having a whole different conversation. So those are some of the things we need to do. We need to make sure that when we are looking at hiring, that we're also thinking about promotion. So particularly in government policy, we ought to be thinking about promotion. I think there are a ton of things that we can do, but they come easily once you are on as a path of urgency about what it is you need to do. My impression is not that we don't have good ideas, it's that we're not urgent about implementing those ideas. I'll take a question from the audience too. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a good idea. I think it was a good idea for South Africa. I think that the Kellogg Foundation has done great work across the country in terms of racial healing. And a lot of their racial healing initiatives have felt to me like truth and reconciliation. Sometimes I'm a bit of an outlier when it comes to what's in the heart. I do think that people need to deal with racism if those are the feelings that they hold. And I don't think that we have to get rid of the racism that people hold in order to make a lot of progress. And so while I am very much in favor of truth and reconciliation and people dealing with the racism that they carry in their hearts and in their minds, I absolutely think that we could make progress in employment, in education, in people being able to stay in communities that connect them to opportunity, that we can make a real difference in terms of employment and making loans to people who are having to scrape by with borrowing money from families when they have a good idea that if they could just go to a bank and get a loan, they could pursue it. So I'm not saying don't do truth and reconciliation. I'm not saying don't do racial healing. I hope that we will. But don't wait to be healed in your heart before we heal society. Anybody with a mic who wants to ask a question? I don't. Yeah? Okay. Oh, you trying to turn it on? I could hear you though. I heard that, yeah. Yeah.
I really connected with your comments on increasing agencies for individuals. What institutions do you think are good at increasing agencies?
It's okay.
Now it's off.
What institutions are good at increasing agency was the question. That was it. It's so important that people who are needing to have more voice to influence decision making are able to increase their ability to impact the things that happen around them. I think that there are a number of community-based organizations that we think of as organizing networks, PICO, Center for Popular Democracy, Gamaliel. I think that those organizing networks do a terrific job of getting into community, pulling people out of their homes into meeting places, talking about what it is they want, and then helping people to see that by organizing, by going to city council, by going to school board, that they can make progress. I think that is an excellent example of people beginning to understand their agency, realizing their agency. I think that there was a very good process, the Sustainable Communities process under the Obama administration, where communities got millions of dollars to be able to plan how to be able to integrate economic equity and environmental issues together. One of the things that we fought hard for with partners was to make sure that at those tables, with access to information, people from communities could do so, and that it should be funded like everything else. We hold up the Twin Cities as a real model for that, because they used $750,000 to be able to bring people from the communities to those tables to make decisions about transportation and economic development and environmental issues. I thought it was excellent. Los Angeles has been very good on the environmental justice issues, that they really have been able to listen to and respond to the agendas that have been put forward by the people in communities around diesel engines just stopping in some communities. That's where they just park to have lunch. And what does that do to the children there in terms of asthma and other things? They were able to lift these issues up, which were not on anybody's radar, and make a difference. I'll give you one more example. In California, the California Endowment, the biggest foundation in California, was very concerned about what was happening with boys and young men of color. And they had their own notions about what the agenda ought to be. But they set up a community process where community got to come in and talk with the foundation about what the issues were. And the community said, one of our biggest issues is push out. That while we are concerned that what's happening in the schools is not what we would want it, the level of push out, young boys in particular, but not exclusively, that were suspended in kindergarten, suspended at an early age, expelled, not in school at all. They said this is the #1 issue. The endowment made it the #1 issue. They were able to help these organizations and these young people to be able to lift up their voice, design what they wanted to have happen, take it to the state legislature. The state legislature convened a select committee on boys and men of color, and they have been able to get more than 100 bills signed by the governor, but the first ones were about push out. I think that's agency. Yeah. Should I take another question here? If you were a local elected official, which you really should be, what would your priority policy be to enhance equity in the community? If I were a local elected official, I would focus on the things that the government has control over and model what it is we want. You know, we spend a lot of time in local government thinking about what others should do without first looking at what we can do in terms of hiring, in terms of promotion, in terms of how are we using all of the government land and property that we own as government. We need to do those assessments, and then we need to do the right thing with that property. We need to make it available. I would make sure that we are prioritizing the entrepreneurs who need to have a chance to be able to come in, and in all of that procurement work, we're making sure that we're getting the resources out to those who need it. I would open up and have participatory budgeting. I would make sure that the people who live in community get to have voice about how we're spending this money. I would be a one-term whatever I was, because the other thing that I would do is I would take away police department budgets. I would slash those budgets tremendously, and I would give some of it to mental health. I'd give some of it to communities. I would build other ways to be able to do dispute resolution. I wouldn't get rid of police altogether, but it would be a much smaller budget, and I would get back to community safety. So I would just take the bold steps that we know we need to take. I'd be content to be a one-time person and hope the person who comes behind me will just keep it going. Yeah. How would universal basic income policies address many of the equity issues? I'm glad that somebody wrote that down because I believe in income supports and I believe in job guarantee. I think that we often end up having a false conversation when we act as if it has to be either or. The problem that people point out with universal basic income is they don't feel it comes from a good place. The idea sort of emerges from Silicon Valley, where people are being conscious of what they're leaving in their wake. You know, we are responsible for our own wake. You see that sign when you're coming in boating. I think people understand that as artificial intelligence and automation and all of these things are happening, they think that we're going to really reduce the jobs that are available. There are a lot of people saying that artificial intelligence and technology can create more jobs, not reduce jobs. That is a different discussion, but there's a lot of literature on it. I would encourage you to read it. But people do feel that one way to respond to the fact that we have disrupted the idea of work is to provide a basic income so that we have a floor below which people will not follow. They propose universal basic income because they think people in this country are so stingy that they won't give anything to people who are poor unless you give something to people who are rich, that everybody has to have it. You know how I feel about that. So I think that universal basic income is being distorted by making it universal. What is really important is basic income. And I think we ought to have a basic income. And you can have a job guarantee program and a basic income. Because if you have a job guarantee program, there's some people who are going to want to use something to improve their skills before they enter, and they ought to have a basic income. There are people who are not going to be able to work for whatever reason, and they need to have a basic income. So I think we need to have a basic income, but we need to have a job guarantee program so that people can experience work, what it means, the organization of work. I don't want to say dignity of work, but it is on the tip of my tongue. The reason I'm hesitant to talk about the dignity of work is for a lot of people, work is not dignified. And it's just going to work does not guarantee dignity. But I do think that going to work is a way to be able to bring people into the economy, and hopefully they can go from there. So I think there is room for basic income to operate alongside a job guarantee. I'm watching the time. How much of this is a zero-sum game? Can we uplift everyone, or do we have to redistribute, as Richard explained? I was the one who clapped for Richard when he said that. I think that we need to think about redistribution, and I don't think that it is going to be a problem because it is not a zero-sum game. We are not a poor country, and we need to stop acting like one. We have the money to do what we need to do to be the nation that we can and must be to continue to thrive. We do need to make sure that we are doing something about the level of inequality that has become toxic. The problem is not inequality. The problem is toxic inequality. Inequality that is hollowing out the middle class, baking in poverty, and stalling economic mobility. The people who are hoarding the money at the top don't need it. They don't need it. We need to get back to having some sense of being a nation with obligations to the other people who are part of it, who are in it. You don't have to be a citizen to be in it. If you're in it, we care about you. We need to just stop acting like we're poor and that some people at the top are going to be hurt if we take more from them. It's called taxes. It's called taxes. There's nothing unusual about taxes. There's nothing new about taxes. There's nothing mean about taxes. It's just what you do when you have a nation. It's what you do. It's how you become a nation. It's how you feel connected. So yeah, we need to do that. And I think that by doing that, a lot of people's shoulders will come down. Because there are a lot of people who are unhappy with this system. People who don't want to claim that they're out of the middle class and they have become part of the wealthy. Why not? What is it about being part of the wealthy that they're uncomfortable with? It's what's going on. And we can bring their shoulders down, right? and people who are super wealthy, who are feeling like we need a universal basic income, and everybody's got to have their own foundation, and everybody's trying to figure out how do we turn capitalism into social impact. What's going on there? People recognize that something's wrong. Inequalities become toxic, it's hurting everybody. It's either hurting you because you're at the bottom, or it's hurting your psyche and your heart because you know it's wrong. And so, yeah, let's just pay some taxes. I think, bye.